The roaring sound of the waves crashing against the wooden hull echoes in the minds of those who sailed during the age of exploration. Imagine sailors staring into the endless blue, their bodies pressed against the relentless salt wind, fighting exhaustion and despair. These brave souls faced storms that threatened to swallow their ships whole, yet their courage carried them forward across uncharted waters. Life aboard was a constant battle against the sea, sickness, and the unknown. Preserving the fallen was a grim reality, with strange methods born of desperation and necessity. Their stories are woven into the fabric of history, revealing a human spirit unbroken amid chaos. If you're fascinated by these epic journeys and the men and women behind them, make sure to subscribe and reach 3,000 followers. Share where you're watching from and drop a ship emoji if you're hooked. Dive deeper into these maritime tales. The ocean's secrets await. You can imagine how it felt to be out there on a ship under a cold, relentless sun, the salt air stinging your skin, and the endless horizon stretching out like a vast, indifferent beast. The wood of the vessel creaked and groaned with every wave, and the smell of damp rope and rotting canvas filled your nostrils. Today, we're diving into the gritty, often gruesome reality of how sailors in the age of exploration kept their bodies intact, sometimes in ways you'd never expect, during those harrowing Atlantic crossings. Back then, ships like caravels, galleons, and naus were the marvels of their time. Built from wood, mostly oak imported from Europe and locally available timbers, they were crafted with techniques passed down through generations. The hulls were layered and sealed with pitch and tar, making them somewhat waterproof, but not foolproof. Sailors relied heavily on rudimentary tools, the astrolabe, compass, and dead reckoning. Navigation was a constant gamble, and trips could last from months to over a year, crossing treacherous waters and unpredictable weather. Life aboard these ships was brutal. Hierarchies were strict, captains at the top, then lieutenants, masters, and the rank-and-file sailors. Crew members faced brutal conditions, biting cold in the North Atlantic, scorching heat near the equator, relentless storms, and the constant threat of disease. Imagine the sound of waves crashing against the hull, the salty spray soaking everything, and the dampness that clung to every surface. The sailors' routine was grueling, sailing, maintaining the ship, and rationing meager provisions. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Salted beef and hardtack, dry, dense bread became staples. But even these could harbor mold and bacteria. Malnutrition and scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, decimated crews, sometimes wiping out nearly 20%. The crew's morale often plummeted when death visited repeatedly. Amid this chaos, preserving the dead was a challenge. You could forget burying someone at sea easily. Ocean currents pushed bodies away, and decomposition was rapid in the humid, salty air. Here's where things get strange and a little morbid. Ancient sailors and explorers devised methods to preserve bodies, delaying decomposition, or at least making the dead more manageable until land was reached. One such method involved embalming techniques that might seem bizarre today. For instance, sailors sometimes used salt or lime to dry out corpses, slowing bacterial activity. Salt in particular was invaluable, an ancient preservative used for centuries, absorbing moisture and creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. Bodies covered in salt could remain recognizable for weeks, sometimes even longer. Another peculiar method involved embalming with alcohol. Rum, brandy, and other spirits weren't just for drinking. They could also serve as preservatives. Crew members would sometimes soak bodies in spirits or rub them with alcohol-soaked cloths, aiming to delay decay during lengthy voyages. This was practical, but it also reflected the crew's need to humanize the dead amid the chaos. In some cases, sailors resorted to more extreme measures. Corpses were sometimes wrapped tightly in tarred canvas or buried in the ship's hold, layered with salt and lime. The aim was to prevent decomposition from filling the ship with putrid smells or spreading disease. The smell of rot could become overwhelming, and contagious diseases like dysentery or fever spread rapidly among crews, often killing more than the ocean storms. Humans are resilient even in death. The methods of preservation tell us a lot about human ingenuity and desperation. They reveal sailors' efforts to humanize the suffering, to hold on to loved ones and comrades, even after death. These techniques, while primitive compared to modern embalming, reflect a deep understanding of materials like salt and alcohol. Think about the psychological toll. Imagine staring at a body wrapped in tar, a mixture of seawater and sweat with the salt crusted on its skin, and knowing that it might be weeks before land. The smell, the sight, these were part of daily life for sailors. Yet they pressed on, driven by the hope of reaching new worlds, even as death lurked all around. So next time you hear about the daring voyages of Columbus, Magellan, or da Gama, remember the human stories, the sailors, the hardships, and the strange, sometimes grim methods they devised to survive and manage death at sea. Their resilience is woven into the very fabric of maritime history, revealing a humanity that faced the unknown with grit, ingenuity, and sometimes strange preservation methods. Can you imagine what it felt like to be trapped inside a wooden prison on the open sea? The air thick with the stench of salt, rotting wood, and sweat, clinging to your skin, cutting through your nostrils. The cold, damp air could be icy or moldy, seeping into your bones, making your teeth chatter even in the heat of midday. Now picture yourself crammed into a tiny space, surrounded by hundreds of gallons of seawater battering the hull, while the crew's voices echo over the creaking timber. Yeah, that's the world of the age of exploration, rough, brutal, and often deadly. Today, we're going to uncover one of the strangest, most gruesome methods sailors and colonizers used to preserve human bodies during those long, treacherous voyages across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and beyond. If you love stories that hit you right in the guts, hit that like button now. And for more deep dives into maritime history, subscribe and ring that bell. So imagine you're on a ship in the 1500s or 1600s, an era when ships were mostly made of wood, powered by wind, and crewed by men living on the edge of survival. These vessels carried not just cargo, but also the hopes, fears, and sometimes the remains of those who didn't make it. The mortality rate was staggering, up to 20% in some crews, and that's not counting those lost to scurvy, dysentery, or storms. Dead bodies weren't just tossed overboard. Sometimes they needed to be preserved for weeks or even months until reaching port. But how? How do you keep flesh from decomposing and turning into a foul mess? Today, we're unraveling a dark chapter. 5 strange methods colonial sailors and explorers used to preserve bodies. Methods so bizarre, you might forget they were real. And trust me, the stories behind them are as gruesome as they are fascinating. First, let's set the scene. Imagine a wooden ship creaking under the storm. Salt spray slapping the deck, a crew exhausted, desperate. Dead bodies pile up, sometimes in the hold, sometimes on deck, wrapped in whatever cloth they had. Without modern embalming, they had to get creative. The main challenge, prevent rapid decomposition, which would turn the corpse into a rotting, disease-spreading nightmare. But cruel as it sounds, they had some grisly solutions. Number 1, salt and drying. The simplest, most straightforward method. Bodies were packed in salt, tons of it, sometimes layered with straw or cloth to absorb moisture. Salt pulls water from tissues through osmosis, drying out the flesh. It's like curing meat, but for humans. The crew hoped that, with enough salt, the body would become a mummified, preserved shell. This worked reasonably well in warm, dry climates. Think the Caribbean or the Middle East. But in cold, damp ships, not so much. Plus, the smell was intense, a combination of sea, sweat, and rotting flesh, enough to make a crew member vomit over the side. Number 2, lime and quicklime. A more aggressive method. Lime, or calcium oxide, was used to desiccate and disinfect bodies. The idea was to douse the corpse in lime, which would accelerate decomposition's endgame, drying out the flesh and killing bacteria and fungi. Some ships carried large barrels of lime, which they'd pour over bodies. The lime's heat and caustic nature could burn through flesh, transforming it into powder over time. But be warned, handling lime was dangerous. It could cause severe burns, and if not managed properly, the dried remains could turn into a chalky, dusty mess. Number 3, tar and resin embalming. This might sound strange, but sailors and colonizers sometimes used tar, yes, the black sticky stuff from pine trees, to coat bodies. The idea: tar creates a waterproof, airtight seal, slowing decay and preventing infection. They'd wrap bodies tightly in cloth soaked in tar or resin, then stow them in the hold. The smell, absolutely horrid, like burning rubber and pine sap. But it worked to some extent, especially for preserving important figures or bodies headed home for burial. Number 4, chemical preservation with arsenic or mercury compounds. Not exactly elegant but effective, at a terrible cost. Some explorers and ship surgeons used arsenic or quicksilver, mercury, to treat bodies. They'd infuse the corpse with these toxic substances which interfered with bacterial activity. Think of it as the colonial version of embalming, but far more hazardous. The process was risky. Exposure could cause poisoning in the crew. But it kept the body looking remarkably fresh, almost like a wax figure, until they reached port. This method was reserved for high-ranking officers or dignitaries. And finally, number 5, specialized burial techniques on ships. When none of the above worked or time was tight, crews resorted to secret methods. Sometimes bodies were buried in sand or ash near the ship's edge, hoping to slow decay. Other times, they'd freeze bodies with ice from the cold Atlantic, though that was rare and limited. More often, they'd stuff corpses with straw or sawdust, trying to dry them out as best as possible. And when the ship docked, bodies were hastily buried in distant lands, sometimes at sea, sometimes ashore, without proper ceremonies. But let's not forget, these methods weren't perfect. Imagine the smell of a decaying body soaked in salt or tar, mingling with the fresh sea air, an assault on the senses. Crew members would develop sores, infections, and often mental scars. The constant threat of disease haunted every sailor. The dead weren't just forgotten. Their preservation was a grim necessity, a testament to human desperation for respect, dignity, or simply to avoid catastrophe. Now, why did they go to such lengths? Well, in an age without refrigeration, embalming, or modern medicine, preserving bodies was crucial for several reasons. Sometimes they wanted to bring loved ones home. Other times, they aimed to preserve the memory of a notable captain or royal. And in some cases, it was about avoiding the deadly spread of contagion on the ship itself. It's shocking, isn't it? We think of exploration as a brave adventure, a quest for new worlds. But behind the scenes, it was sometimes a grim, morbid struggle against decay and death itself. These methods, crude, dangerous, and often grotesque, highlight just how much human resilience and ingenuity were tested in the harshest of conditions. If you want to see exactly how some of these preservation techniques looked, or hear more stories about the sailors who faced these horrors, check out the video I've got linked here in the card. There, I walk you through detailed examples, from shipwrecks to preserved bodies unearthed centuries later, still haunting us with their stories. So next time you step into a modern morgue, think about the primitive tools and desperate measures sailors used centuries ago. The marine world of the colonial era was brutal, unrelenting. And the methods they devised to hold on to their dead, well, they tell us a lot about human tenacity, fear, and the dark side of exploration. And remember, these methods weren't just about preservation. They were about survival, dignity, and the human need to keep loved ones close, even in death. That's a story worth telling. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a creaking ship, the salty wind whipping against your face. Below, the dark, cold waters threatened to swallow everything. Life at sea in the age of exploration was a relentless game of survival. But beyond the dangers of storms, scurvy, and mutiny, there was another, often overlooked horror: the grim fight against decay and death itself. Back then, sailors faced a brutal reality. If someone died on board, their body couldn't just be left to rot or thrown into the ocean. No modern morgues, no refrigeration, no embalming fluids. They had to improvise, sometimes with shocking ingenuity, to delay the inevitable. And the methods they devised tell us more about human resilience and desperation than any adventure story. Let's start with a common problem: decomposition. When someone died, their body quickly began to smell, attracting rats and spreading disease. The first solution? Well, they often used salt, not just a sprinkle for flavor, but heaps of it, up to 2,000 pounds in some cases, to dry out the corpse. The idea was simple: remove moisture, slow bacteria's feast. The sailors packed bodies in barrels filled with salt, pressing them down to squeeze out the juices. The smell. Imagine a damp, rotten corpse coated in sharp, icy salt. Disgusting, but better than the alternative. This method could keep a body preserved for weeks, even months, especially if the ship was well stocked with salt from the colonies. But salt wasn't always enough. The sea was a cruel, unpredictable place. What if the body swelled and burst? Sometimes the corpse was wrapped tightly in tarred cloth. Tar was a common maritime material, creating a seal to contain the decay. Others cut into the flesh, removing parts prone to faster decomposition, like the stomach or intestines, because these areas produce gases that cause bloating and rupture. Imagine a sailor named Jack, whose body was tied tightly in canvas and soaked in vinegar. Vinegar, a cheap antiseptic, was believed to slow bacteria and preserve tissue. It was a crude, primitive antiseptic, but on a ship, it was all they had. And it wasn't just about delaying rot. Sometimes they wanted the body to look decent when it was finally brought home. Embalming was still in its infancy, but some sailors experimented with drying agents. They would inject the body with alcohol, made from ship's rum or imported spirits, to kill bacteria from the inside out. This process, called treatment, was risky and not always successful, but it was better than nothing. Imagine the brave sailor holding a rag soaked in spirits, attempting to preserve a captain's body for the long voyage back to port. The smell of alcohol mixing with decay, an eerie, volatile cocktail. But wait, it gets worse. Sometimes the problem wasn't just decomposition, but the infestation of insects or larvae. If a body wasn't properly sealed, maggots could hatch inside, turning flesh into a writhing mass. In some cases, sailors used a crude form of mummification. They coated the corpse in resin, like pine tar or pitch, and dried it in the sun, turning it into a sort of maritime mummy. It was grotesque, but it served as a grim monument, a testament to their attempt to control death in the middle of the ocean. Now imagine you're a sailor, and your ship is caught in a storm. The waves crash over the deck, and someone falls ill. The ship is crowded, the air thick with salt and sweat. You watch as the sickness spreads, fever, vomiting, blood. The crew's morale dips lower than the hull. Dead bodies accumulate and the crew must decide what to do. Sometimes they toss the bodies overboard quickly, but that risked spreading infection. Other times they buried the dead in the ship's hold, wrapped tightly in cloth, hoping these crude methods would buy them some time. But the problem wasn't just sanitation, it was the psychological toll. Think about the mental scars. Imagine the faces of sailors like Mateo, haunted by the smell of decay, their hands trembling as they deal with their fallen comrades. The constant threat of disease, the grotesque rituals to preserve their dead, they were living in a sort of limbo. Each corpse was a reminder of their mortality, a grim anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The screams of rats in the dark, the sight of bloated bodies, the tang of rotting flesh, it wore down even the strongest. And it wasn't just about keeping the dead or delaying decay. Sometimes sailors resorted to more bizarre methods. They would stuff bodies with straw or sawdust, cheap, accessible materials, to stiffen them, making handling easier during burial at sea. Others used chemicals like arsenic or quicklime, trying to dry out tissues faster. Quicklime, in particular, was popular because it reacted with moisture, causing the body to desiccate rapidly. Imagine a sailor measuring out the lime, with a nervous tremor, knowing that a miscalculation could cause the body to explode or release toxic fumes. But it wasn't only the bodies that posed problems. The ship itself was a living organism, wood, rope, metal, constant battle against rot, mold, and corrosion. And here, ingenuity shined. Sailors and shipbuilders used tar and pitch to waterproof hulls, sealing leaks and preventing rot. Sometimes they'd replace rotted planks with fresh oak, often sourced from the colonies, up to 100 or more trees per vessel. They carried carpenters and blacksmiths, constantly patching, repairing, fighting to keep the ship afloat. And imagine the sailors, young, often barely out of adolescence, faced with these horrors daily. Gingivas bleeding, teeth falling out from scurvy, wounds never healing because of poor nutrition. Their bodies and minds worn thin, yet they kept going, driven by the promise of new lands, riches, adventure. The ship was their prison, their refuge, and their grave. Now compare all this with today's modern morgues: refrigeration, embalming, worlds apart. We've got high-tech tools, precise temperatures, chemical preservatives. But back then, they had desperation, crude materials, and a relentless will to survive. They improvised with what was available: salt, vinegar, tar, lime, alcohol. Each method, a small miracle given the circumstances. If you want to see exactly how some of these preservation techniques looked, pictures, diagrams, even preserved bodies, there's a video linked here in the card. I walk you through detailed examples, from wrecks where bodies were found centuries later, still remarkably intact, to stories of sailors who faced these horrors head-on. It's a window into a brutal world where mortality was a constant companion. Next time you step into a modern morgue with refrigerated drawers and formaldehyde fumes, just think, these sailors, in their primitive makeshift ways, fought to hold on to their dead, not just for respect, but for survival. These methods reveal their dark, relentless struggle against death, their ingenuity in the face of despair, and their unbreakable human spirit. Because at the heart of all this, beneath the salt and the rot, was a simple human truth. Even in the face of decay, we cling to dignity, to memory, to the hope that somehow they'll be remembered. And that story, my friend, is as old as the seas themselves. Imagine yourself aboard a wooden vessel, the air thick with salt and the acrid sting of tar. The sun beats down relentlessly, turning the deck into a blistering, unforgiving surface. You're one of hundreds of sailors packed tightly in a prison afloat, hunched over, constantly alert. Every day is a fight to survive, but the worst is yet to come. Today, we're diving into some of the strangest methods humans used to preserve their dead during the age of colonization, the 15th to 18th centuries. And trust me, these stories are as brutal as they are fascinating. Back then, death was never far away. Disease, starvation, storms, and conflicts claimed lives at an alarming rate. The mortality rate on ships could reach 20%, sometimes even higher. But it wasn't just about losing crew members, it was about dealing with their bodies amid the chaos. Imagine the smell: foul, sickening, rotting flesh mixing with salt and wood. The crew's mental toll. Beyond exhaustion, it was despair. Bodies decomposed in hours, and they couldn't just toss them overboard like we do today. The ocean was a massive graveyard, but sometimes space and time demanded more. Now picture the crew faced with a dilemma. They can't just leave bodies in the hold. Disease spreads fast. Bodies must be preserved, at least temporarily, to avoid contaminating everything else. So they got creative. The methods they devised, bizarre, crude, sometimes gruesome, were born out of sheer necessity. Cruel, but real. One of the earliest techniques. Salt? Lots of it. Salt was their best friend. They packed bodies in barrels filled with coarse salt, hoping to draw out moisture. Salt created a hostile environment for bacteria. Think of it as a primitive fridge, but brutal and desiccating. It worked reasonably well, but was far from perfect. Bodies often still rotted or gave off a terrible stench, especially during long voyages. But sometimes the crew had to go further. Enter the use of vinegar and lime. These acids help slow decay and kill surface bacteria. Imagine the pungent aroma, sharp, biting, almost as if the ship itself was fighting to breathe. The crew would rub lime juice or vinegar over the bodies, sometimes wrapping them in burlap, soaked in these substances. This was no gentle act. It was a desperate bid to hold on to their comrades, to keep decay at bay long enough for the ship to reach port. And it wasn't just about chemicals. They also used tar, a sticky black substance, to coat bodies, like sealing them in a waterproof shell. Tar was a double-edged sword. It slowed decomposition, but also meant dealing with the terrible smell and the mess. Imagine trying to smear hot, viscous tar over a corpse in the confined space of a ship's hold. That's some grim perseverance. But perhaps the most strange of all, the practice of mummification-like preservation. Yes, some crews resorted to drying out bodies in the sun or using heat. They'd prop up corpses in corners, exposing them to dry, salty air, hoping the natural environment would do what embalming can do today. It sounds bizarre, but on ships where resources were scarce, necessity forced innovation. They'd preserve a body just enough to keep it recognizable, sometimes for weeks or even months. And still, the horror didn't end there. If the voyage was especially long, bodies were sometimes stored in sealed containers filled with alcohol, brandy, or spirits, like a primitive form of embalming. The alcohol's antiseptic properties slowed decay, but it also meant the crew was constantly exposed to the sharp odor of spirits and the unsettling sight of floating, embalmed bodies. Imagine the mental strain, seeing friends turned into ghostly, preserved figures, their faces forever frozen in time. But here's where it gets even darker. Sometimes, in the chaos of a long voyage, bodies were simply thrown into the sea. Cruel, yes. But other times, crew would keep them on board, wrapped in cloth, stacked in the hold like cargo. They couldn't afford to lose sailors. Each was vital. Yet the psychological toll, unimaginable. The smell, the sight of decomposing flesh, the screams of the dying, all blending into a nightmare that haunted every sailor. And this brings us to an important point, the human stories behind these gruesome methods. Imagine a young sailor, barely 16, watching his best friend's body being wrapped in tar and salt, knowing they might need to do this again in a week. Or the old blacksmith, whose hands trembled as he smeared vinegar on a corpse, knowing it might be his turn next. These men carried not just cargo and crew, but stories of sacrifice, resilience, and unyielding will to survive. What was the real challenge? Beyond the technical, it was psychological. To see your comrades transformed into grim, preserved statues, part of the ship's dark furniture, would haunt your dreams. Many sailors suffered nightmares, tremors, or even breakdowns. The physical toll was immense, exposure to cold, chemicals, and the constant threat of infection. Their bodies and minds changed. They became hardened, sometimes numb, to the reality of death. But these methods weren't just about hygiene. They reflected a profound human resilience. These sailors, these colonizers, they faced death head-on. They refused to let decay claim their friends outright. They invented crude but effective ways to hold on to dignity, to remember those lost. Now compare all this to today. Modern morgues, with their refrigeration, embalming fluids, and precise procedures. We can forget the smell, the mess, the horror. Thanks to technology, death isn't the same fearsome shadow it once was. Yet in the 16th and 17th centuries, death was raw, visceral. Every preserved body was a testament to human ingenuity amid despair. And here's the real lesson. Behind every method, be it salt, vinegar, tar, alcohol, lies a story of incredible courage. Ordinary sailors, facing extraordinary circumstances, fought not just the sea, but mortality itself. Their sacrifices, their struggles, they're the silent heroes of history. Think about that as you consider the comfort and safety we enjoy today. So next time you're grateful for modern conveniences, take a moment. Reflect on those anonymous sailors, whose bodies were turned into macabre artifacts, yet whose spirits endured. Their stories remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest moments. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the next video. Because these tales of courage and endurance are the true legacy of our maritime past. The seas have always demanded sacrifice, and those brave enough to sail them, to face death head-on, have left footprints in history that still inspire us today. In the end, their sacrifices weren't just about survival, they were about honoring the human spirit, about holding on to dignity when the world around you is sinking into decay. That's the real voyage,